Imagine being worth billions, controlling a global tech empire, and then, one day, standing at a gas station, unable to pay for $23 of fuel. That's exactly what happened to Alexander Mitchell, a fallen billionaire whose humiliating moment would spark a chain of events no one could have imagined. And it all began with two little girls and a purse full of coins. This is the story of how the kindness of children ignited one of the greatest corporate takedowns in American history. The sun was beginning to dip low over the wide Texas horizon when Alexander Mitchell pulled into the Shell station on Route 65. The dusty air carried the scent of gasoline and fried food from the diner across the road. Alexander, once the commanding figure at the helm of a $3.4 billion tech empire, now looked like any other weary traveler. His sharp gray suit hung looser than it used to, his tie slightly crooked, the weight of years and secrets etched into the corners of his eyes. He stepped out of his black Mercedes, trying to keep his head low, but even a man trying to vanish cannot hide the aura of someone who once commanded boardrooms and headlines. He filled the tank, the pump ticking steadily as his mind raced. Every mile further from Dallas was another mile away from the life he had abandoned. But as he walked inside to pay, something inside him told him this night would not let him remain invisible. The station was moderately crowded. Truckers grabbing coffee, locals waiting for cigarettes, a group of college kids laughing too loud in the corner. Alexander placed his card on the counter with quiet confidence. The attendant, a young man, with a crooked cap, slid it through the machine, frowned, and shook his head. "Declined," he said flatly, already impatient. Alexander blinked. That wasn't possible. He pulled out another card, the platinum one that had never failed him in over a decade. The line behind him began to grow restless. Again, the machine beeped, and again the attendant shook his head. "Sir, this one's no good either." A chuckle escaped from someone in the back. Murmurs began, low at first, then sharper. "What, the Mercedes guy can't pay $23? A man sneered. Laughter rolled through the room, bouncing off the fluorescent lights. Alexander's throat tightened. He pulled his third card from his wallet, his hands betraying a faint tremor. The moment the machine spat it back with another red beep, the mockery exploded. Phones were out now, recording, snapping photos. "Fake rich influencer," someone shouted. "Hey, billionaire, need a loan?" Another voice. "Sell your car, buddy." The humiliation hit him in waves, heavier than the heat outside, heavier than the life he had tried to bury. He, the man who once signed billion-dollar acquisitions with a flick of his pen, now reduced to begging a soulless card reader for mercy. His heart hammered against his ribs, his jaw clenched, and yet he stood there frozen, unable to argue, unable to explain. Then, like a ripple breaking the tide, two small figures stepped forward from the back of the line. Twin girls, no more than 8 years old, identical freckles on their cheeks and braids tied with mismatched ribbons. One clutched a faded pink purse. They approached him with shy bravery, eyes wide but voices steady. "Mister," one of them said, "we have some money. You can use it." The other carefully unzipped the purse, counting coins and a few crumpled bills. Together, they placed $15.60 on the counter. "Grandma always told us," one whispered. "If you can help, you help." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even the jeering voices quieted, unsure how to mock innocence this pure. Alexander felt his knees weaken, and he slowly knelt down before the girls, his eyes burning with a mix of shame and gratitude. His hand trembled as he touched the coins, but it wasn't the money that broke him. It was the kindness, the reminder that humanity still flickered in unexpected corners. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Thank you." Around them, whispers started again, some mocking, some softened. A few still filmed, eager for the viral spectacle. By nightfall, the internet was ablaze with clips of the once glorious Alexander. Mitchell hunched on the floor of a gas station, saved by the pocket change of children. The hashtag spread like wildfire. Billionaire beggar. Memes painted him as a fraud, a fallen king, a man who had lost everything. Across the nation, strangers laughed at his disgrace, blind to the truth simmering beneath. For Alexander knew something the crowd did not. His cards were not empty. His wealth had not vanished by chance. They had been blocked, deliberately, surgically, by someone who wanted him cornered, humiliated, visible again. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he stood there, still reeling. He glanced at the screen, and the name froze his blood. Jonathan Kane. Once his partner, now his greatest enemy. The man who had stolen not just his company but the safety of everyone connected to him. The text was short, venomous in its simplicity. Disappearing isn't working. Some secrets are too big for one man. Maybe it's time to give up. Alexander felt the world tilt, his humiliation twisting into something far darker. Jonathan had found him, pierced through the fragile anonymity he had built, and as his gaze drifted back to the twin girls still watching him with hopeful smiles, a colder realization seeped into his bones. Jonathan would not stop at destroying him. He would target anyone who stood in his path, even the innocent souls, who had shown kindness at a gas station in Texas. Alexander straightened, forcing his face into calm. But inside, he knew the storm was only beginning. The night after the gas station incident, Alexander sat alone in a dimly lit motel room off Route 65, staring at the cracked screen of his phone. His name was everywhere now, but not for the reasons it once had been. Years ago, business journals had praised him as a visionary, a man who turned Technocore Industries into a juggernaut of innovation. Tonight, his face was plastered across every social media platform as a laughingstock. Memes twisted his humiliation into cruel entertainment. One video in particular made his stomach turn, a remix of Grace's innocent voice offering to help him. Her words, "We can pay for him," had been looped into a mock dance track, blasted across TikTok and Instagram with millions of views. What had been an act of compassion from two children was now weaponized mockery, and Alexander could almost hear Jonathan Kane laughing behind it all. The betrayal still burned fresh, though years had passed. Jonathan had once been his closest friend, his confidant. Together, they had built Technocore from a garage operation into a powerhouse. But as profits soared, Alexander discovered something buried deep within the company's operations: algorithms, being weaponized not for harmless marketing but for mass surveillance. Ordinary citizens tracked through their phones and cameras without consent. Dissenters blackmailed into silence. Data manipulated to swing elections, bending democracy itself like a wire. Contracts traced to offshore accounts, proof of politicians. Bought like commodities. Alexander had stumbled upon the truth. Technocore wasn't just a tech giant, it was a machine of control. He had refused to stay silent. He remembered the boardroom that day, his voice firm as he demanded accountability, Jonathan's smile too calm, too rehearsed. Hours later, the board turned against him. His shares diluted, his reputation smeared. The press briefed with carefully crafted lies. Jonathan didn't just betray him, he orchestrated his exile. Now, years later, the same man was taunting him again, proving that his reach was endless. Alexander's phone buzzed once more. Another text from Jonathan. "Cute kids at the gas station. Be a shame if something happened to their family. Stop running, Alex. Stop pretending you can win." Alexander's pulse quickened. Jonathan's threat wasn't vague. It was direct, deliberate. He had identified the twins, Grace and Hope, and if Alexander didn't act, their lives could be torn apart just as his had been. But Alexander wasn't entirely powerless. Long before he vanished from the corporate world, he had built his insurance policy, a digital dead man's switch. If he failed to log in every 72 hours, encrypted files would detonate across the internet, flooding news outlets, watchdog agencies, and public archives with undeniable evidence. Contracts signed by corrupt officials, bank transfers to offshore accounts, secret recordings of Jonathan and his allies boasting about manipulating elections. Enough to put 23 high-ranking figures, politicians, executives, even a judge, behind bars. It was the sword dangling above Jonathan's empire, and Alexander had kept it hidden for this very moment. Yet it wasn't revenge that drove him anymore. As he remembered the bravery of those two girls with their pink purse and coins, the mission shifted in his heart. Protecting them, protecting innocents like them, was now his true purpose. If Jonathan was willing to threaten children, then the corruption wasn't just political or financial, it was moral rot at its deepest level. The next morning, Alexander reached out to the only ally he believed could still make a difference. Samantha Torres, an award-winning investigative journalist, had built her reputation on exposing corporate crimes others were too afraid to touch. They met in a quiet diner off the interstate, Samantha sliding into the booth with her recorder tucked discreetly into her bag. Alexander placed a flash drive on the table, his eyes steady. When she opened the files, her face paled. She scrolled through documents detailing Fourth Amendment violations, surveillance logs on millions of Americans, and wire transfers to senators whose campaigns had been sponsored by Technocore. "This," she whispered, "this is bigger than Watergate. This is a blueprint for controlling an entire nation." Alexander leaned in. "If I disappear, these files go public. But I don't want chaos. I want accountability. Help me." Samantha nodded, resolve hardening in her expression. Together, they began sketching out a plan, a way to expose everything strategically, piece by piece, in a way that would protect the vulnerable while dismantling Jonathan's empire. Meanwhile, across the country, in a penthouse office in Manhattan, Jonathan Caney swirled a glass of scotch as he watched stock prices tick upward on giant screens. He had turned Alexander's humiliation into a spectacle, ensuring public opinion buried any chance of redemption. "The higher the stock climbs, the harder he'll fall," Jonathan smirked. At his side stood Marcus Webb, head of corporate security, a former CIA operative with cold, unreadable eyes. Webb confirmed that Alexander's movements were being tracked in real time. "We'll tighten the net, push him to slip, and the family of those twins?" Jonathan grinned. "A few subtle reminders. Harassment, fear, nothing direct. Yet. Enough to make him crack." Jonathan raised his glass, savoring his illusion of control. "Alexander thinks he's playing chess, but I built the board." Back in Texas, Alexander knew time was running short. His enemies had resources, influence, and the willingness to target children to get what they wanted. But he had truth, evidence, and now an ally willing to risk everything. The war between them had begun again. Only this time, the stakes were no longer personal. They were human lives caught in the crossfire. The night was quiet in the suburbs, but Alexander Mitchell moved. With purpose, his steps heavy with resolve. He arrived at Grace and Hope's elementary school, a modest red-brick building that had seen better days. Principal Dorothy Washington was startled when she found him waiting in her office, but Alexander's tone was steady, his eyes fierce. Without theatrics, he slid a cashier's check across the desk, $250,000, enough to fund security upgrades, surveillance systems, and scholarships for every child in the building. Dorothy hesitated, asking why a man whose face was now mocked across every screen in America would give so much. Alexander's answer was simple and piercing. "Two children reminded me who I was. I will not let them pay the price for my war." His voice broke slightly, but his conviction did not. For the first time since the gas station, Dorothy saw not a humiliated man but a leader, a protector, a father to every child who might fall victim to the shadows he was fighting. But far away, in a glass tower in Manhattan, Jonathan Caney sat, at the top floor of Technocore's headquarters, sipping vintage bourbon with an easy smile. His empire was flourishing. The memes and smear campaigns had destroyed Alexander's public credibility, and the stock market had rewarded his ruthless control with a surge in value. He listened as Marcus Webb, his chief of security and a former CIA strategist, reported on the harassment already in motion. Surprise audits, tax investigations, and falsified paperwork were being funneled toward Grace and Hope's family. Pressure was mounting, designed to remind Alexander that kindness would cost lives. Jonathan leaned back, amused, certain his old friend would collapse under the weight of trying to protect two innocent girls while waging an unwinnable war against a corporation that practically owned Washington. But Alexander was not the broken man Jonathan imagined. He returned to the world he once helped build, exploiting hidden backdoors he had left buried deep within Technocore's systems. Invisible to the untrained eye, his code seeped through firewalls and encrypted servers, quietly copying every email, every transaction, every meeting log the company generated. He moved like a ghost inside the machine, his fingerprints masked, his presence undetectable. At the same time, he began to recruit ethical hackers who had once admired him, former employees disgusted with the company's corruption, and journalists hungry for the truth. All began to form a shadow network around him. They didn't see a fallen CEO. They saw a man willing to burn his empire to ash to protect two children who had offered him nothing more than kindness. Samantha Torres became his anchor in the storm. Tireless and sharp, she combed through terabytes of data, connecting dots no one else had the patience to find. One night, her face drained of color as she uncovered a chilling thread. Internal corporate emails confirming a campaign of harassment against Grace and Hope's family. School records were being flagged for irregularities. Their grandmother's medical benefits suddenly suspended. Even false CPS complaints being drafted. It was clear now, Jonathan was turning the selfless act of two little girls into a weapon, attempting to crush Alexander by forcing him to watch innocents bleed under corporate cruelty. The discovery ignited a fire inside Alexander. He had once fought for shareholders, for quarterly earnings, for boardroom battles measured in millions. But this war was different. Now it was personal, raw, and unrelenting. Grace and Hope had unknowingly lit a fuse inside him, and he would not stop until the men who preyed on innocents were dragged into the light. He told Samantha the time had come. They would not wait for Jonathan to strike harder. They would strike first. At the peak of Jonathan's arrogance, when his public campaign of mockery was at its loudest, Alexander triggered the deadliest move in his arsenal. The network of journalists, hackers, and whistleblowers acted in perfect unison. 15 major media outlets, across television, print, and digital, published the Technocore files at the exact same moment. The release was a tidal wave of evidence. Secret contracts for surveillance programs targeting millions of Americans, blackmail dossiers used to manipulate senators, records of election interference stretching back a decade, and mountains of bank transfers revealing corporate bribes. But the most damning piece was not paper, it was a voice. An audio file slipped into the release captured Jonathan Caney himself, his words dripping with menace. It would be a shame if something happened to their family. The cruelty was undeniable, the threat unmistakable. America heard the voice of its corporate overlord not as a visionary, but as a predator willing to endanger children to protect his empire. The backlash was instant and volcanic. Social media lit up like wildfire. Outrage swept across the nation. Parents demanding justice, activists flooding the streets, politicians scrambling to distance themselves from the very man who had bought their silence. Hashtags surged to the top of global trends. Technocore files, Protect Grace and Hope, Billionaire Bully. The country's mood shifted overnight. What had once been a cruel joke about a fallen CEO was now a story of two little girls whose kindness had sparked the exposure of one of the greatest corporate scandals in modern history. Alexander watched the chaos unfold from the shadows. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. His war was far from over, but the world was no longer laughing. The truth had broken free, and with it, the balance of power began to tilt. Jonathan had spent years building a fortress of lies, but Alexander had discovered the one weapon even the strongest fortress could not withstand: the courage of children and the fury of a nation betrayed. The storm that Alexander had unleashed struck Jonathan Kane's empire with brutal precision. Within hours of the Technicore files release, the stock market recoiled in panic. Shares plummeted 42% in a single day, billions evaporating as investors fled. Analysts who once praised Jonathan's vision now called him reckless, corrupt, a danger to democracy itself. The following morning, black SUVs rolled up to Technicore's glittering Manhattan headquarters. FBI agents in dark jackets swarmed the building, seizing hard drives, servers, and boxes of paper files. Cameras caught the moment Jonathan himself was escorted out in handcuffs, his once pristine suit wrinkled, his arrogant smirk replaced with a hollow stare. By evening, his colleagues had vanished, his board of directors resigning en masse. His wife filed for divorce within days, and every account he had ever touched was frozen. The man who once seemed untouchable had been reduced to a disgraced figure on the evening news, a cautionary tale of power rotting from the inside. Yet, amid the chaos, a different story was rising, one that captured the heart of a nation. Grace and Hope, the little girls who had unknowingly sparked the unraveling of a corporate empire, were invited onto national television. Sitting beside their mother, their words cut through the noise with the clarity of innocence. Grace, her voice steady beyond her years, looked straight into the camera and said, "Kindness knows no color or money. We helped because it was right." Her statement spread like wildfire, quoted in headlines, shared on posters, and repeated by millions. Then Hope, fidgeting slightly in her chair, added a simple truth that carried the weight of wisdom. Bad people are bad because they forgot how to be good. That clip became one of the most replayed videos of the year, a piece of childlike honesty that pierced through cynicism and reminded the world of something it had almost forgotten: that decency still mattered. For Alexander, those words became a beacon. No longer defined by the billions he had lost or the humiliation he had endured, he chose to build something new, something rooted not in greed, but in the values Grace and Hope had given back to him. He founded the Grace and Hope Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and safeguarding children's futures. Unlike his past empire of steel and glass, his new office was built in Austin, Texas. Not a skyscraper, but a modest space overlooking a playground where children laughed and ran freely. The symbolism was deliberate. Power no longer meant towering above people, but standing beside them. Former employees of Technicore, once too afraid to speak, began reaching out, joining him with renewed purpose. They were not chasing profits. Now, they were chasing justice. In its very first year, the foundation processed over 200 cases of corruption. Executives once thought untouchable were marched into courtrooms, facing sentences for fraud, bribery, and exploitation. Billions in fines were redirected back into public programs, schools rebuilt, hospitals funded, communities given the resources they had been denied. The story of two little girls had grown into a movement reshaping the landscape of accountability. Netflix announced a feature-length documentary titled Little Heroes, Big Changes, chronicling the unlikely journey that began with a pink purse and a handful of coins. Meanwhile, Jonathan Kane's fall reached its bitter end. Tried and convicted, he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. No longer the master of boardrooms and backroom deals, he found himself in a cramped apartment in Detroit on probation, awaiting transfer, stripped of everything except his name, a name that now carried only shame. One night, as the television flickered in his barren living room, he watched Grace and Hope appear again on screen, smiling as they spoke about the Foundation's new library project. He stared, hollow and broken, realizing that 2 children had displayed more integrity in a single act than he had in his entire career. For the first time in decades, Jonathan felt the weight of his own emptiness. The final scene unfolded at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new school library funded by the Foundation. Children ran through the doors with wide eyes, clutching fresh books, their laughter filling the halls. Grace turned to Alexander, her eyes bright. "Teacher says you helped children everywhere," she told him with pride. Alexander's voice softened, heavy with emotion. "No, you did. I just carried your kindness forward." Hope, never without her little treasures, reached into her bag and pulled out the same pink purse that had started it all. She held it, up, showing the 1560 still tucked safely inside. "We're keeping it," she said firmly, "in case someone needs help again." Alexander's eyes welled with tears as he smiled, overwhelmed by the simplicity and purity of their gift. The story did not end in flames, but in light. As the camera lingered on Alexander standing beside Grace and Hope, their laughter rising. Above the sounds of celebration, a quiet truth became clear. The greatest revenge is not destruction, but creation. Alexander Mitchell had lost everything the world said mattered, yet in protecting kindness, he had found something far greater than billions. What began as humiliation at a gas station had become a revolution of compassion. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes are not born in boardrooms or battlefields, but in the small, selfless acts of children holding a purse with $15 and hearts full of courage.